Hello, I'm Clive Collings. I'm a Chief Inspector in Nottinghamshire Police.
Brilliant. How did you get to be where you are then? Because chief inspector is quite a high rank, isn't it?
So yeah, I joined the police in 1997, aged 21. So I went straight from university. I think I graduated from university in the June and joined the police in the July, which was kind of pros and cons, I guess. There was such a small gap. There's times when I've sort of looked back and thought, I wish I'd done a bit of travelling. But the flip side of that, Hayley, is that I get to retire in 4 years, which I know. Before you say it, I don't look old enough. Thanks very much.
You
Appreciate
actually
it.
don't look old enough. It's frustrating.
I don't look as young as you, so but no. So I joined South Yorkshire. We worked in Sheffield for the majority of my time there. I've worked in response, neighbourhoods, a bit of CID, a few other specialist departments that we'll probably talk about as we go through. And then I became a sergeant in, I think, 2009. Again, promoted to Sheffield, and in that rank, did a mixture of response, neighbourhoods, a bit of time within our senior command team in South Yorkshire, a couple of other projects and bits and bobs like that. Obviously, I know you, Hayley, from working in Rotherham within neighbourhoods. And then in 2020, so after 10 years, I became an inspector, and then moved to Nottinghamshire on promotion in 2022. So just coming up to 12 months ago. And again, I kind of feel like I've been really fortunate. It's been 26 years, but I've never really actively sought out. I've never been sort of focused solely on promotion. I've kind of just looked to experience the breadth of kind of different roles and kind of utilize the experience as best I can, and that's naturally kind of become getting promoted and going through the ranks. Although there are people who I know who've progressed much more quickly than I have, and all power to them for doing it that way. I suppose from my perspective, and I joined the police straight from university at 21 and was probably quite shy and lacked a bit of confidence really. And it's taken me, it took me a bit of time to kind of find my feet, I think, as a PC on a shift, and probably walk into a room. And historically, whereas I'd walk into a room and I'd constantly be looking at what everybody else could do that I couldn't do, and focus on my shortcomings. I think it wasn't until I did a job like working in the command suite as a staff officer that you realise that actually a lot of people are just very good at selling themselves and just probably had more confidence than I did. And then as I've sort of got more experienced and I've been more confident in the experience that I've gathered and the range of roles that I've undertaken, I think you start to value yourself more. And then from my perspective, that manifested itself in being able to walk into a room and appreciate what you add to things as opposed to what you're missing. And then you kind of become more, as I've become more confident, that's then kind of meant that I've felt more able to put myself forward for promotion or for different roles. So that's a very long answer to your first question, Hayley, so I apologise.
No, it's good. I think what's interesting as well how young you started, because most of our recruits now, the age has shifted. So they're a lot
Yeah.
younger than they were maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We've got people coming for the PCDAs, the apprenticeship and the DHEP.
Yeah.
Probably sitting around the early 20s as an average age. So that's quite good advice, I think, for those as well.
It's good, but it's incredibly depressing when you're doing new recruit interviews. My brother, who's still an inspector in South Yorkshire, was doing new recruit interviews a couple of weeks ago, and he said he was interviewing people who weren't born when he started in the police, and that happens quite regularly now. I mean, I was in London yesterday, and I got the train and happened to end up sitting next to somebody on the train who'd just been for their day 2 of their recruitment in the Met, and he was born in 1999, and it's just depressing when you hear that sort of thing. It makes you feel really old.
Oh, bless you. What do you think of the new, which is a bit of a controversial question actually, what do you think of the new entry routes into the police?
I think it's useful to. I mean, ultimately, the goal for policing is to try and create an organisation or a service that is reflective of the communities that it serves. And I know certainly here in Nottinghamshire, and I know from my experience in South Yorkshire, it can be difficult to recruit from some different communities or some different demographics in terms of age or gender or whatever. So I think it's useful to have as many routes as you can, as many different ways of accessing people. Here in Nottinghamshire, we're piloting a scheme where we're recruiting former military people. So we've got the first cohort of fast-track military personnel into the organisation, which starts later this month. So I think that's just one of a range of ways that we can bring people in. I think I've probably got some kind of reservations about the fact that the College of Policing directed that everybody who joins the police must have done a degree, purely because I think when I think back to my service and some of the people that I've worked with, there are some people who I've worked with who were the best one in the world will probably never pass a degree, because it's just not how they're made up. But they could add so much more because they were physically imposing, or because they turned their hands to different things that weren't necessarily academic. And I sometimes worry that actually, if we're saying that everybody's got to reach a particular academic standard, that could then have the knock-on effect of losing people who might otherwise be really useful to the service. But yeah, I think that the broader the breadth of roles, the broader the breadth of routes into the organisation, I think the better, because it just allows us to potentially access communities and groups of people that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to get hold of.
Yeah, it's good. I think I like the PCDA because we give them the degree, we pay for it.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah,
that's quite nice, because if you can't afford to get your fees or to do a student loan, it's quite a nice way for someone to progress their like futures, whether or not they stay with the police or not. I think that's quite a nice little thing we do. That's really interesting about the military.
Yeah, so it's something I hadn't heard of before, and I think we're the first force in the country to do it. But yeah, it's there's obviously some real transferable skills from the armed forces into policing. It tends to be, and you just touched on the fact that a lot of the student officers that are joining us now are younger age-wise and probably haven't got the breadth of life experience. And I suppose that's just a counter to that a little bit, because these will be people who will naturally be older and will have probably some fairly unique life experience. And I think that's the whole thing, isn't it? The policing needs a blend of people. I think if we focus too heavily on one specific demographic, you're making life a little bit difficult. And I look back to when I was 21 and I joined the police, and I sort of talked about not being massively confident. But I was also, my parents, we'd never got a lot of money when I was growing up, but my parents were very good at, they protected me from the worst of society. And I remember starting in the police at 21 and working in some of the council estates in Sheffield, and it was a real eye opener. And I think it's one of those situations where it's fight or flight.
Yeah.
And thankfully, I managed to survive those first few years and gain the experience that then gave me the confidence to go into those environments armed with a little bit of experience, a little bit of knowledge. But I think policing is one of those jobs where until you really get your feet wet, until you really try it, you never really know how you're going to respond to some of the situations that you're thrust into.
Yeah. You mentioned that you've done quite a lot of different like specialisms.
Yeah.
What's your favourite?
So one of the things that I've done sort of in the last few years is public order command. So I've done public order policing for quite a long time. So people will know that in terms of maybe going to a football match and seeing police officers, or if you see a protest, and on sort of over and above that sort of level of policing that you see on the ground, you've then got a command structure. So a bronze commander is basically bronze, silver, gold. A bronze commander is kind of on the ground. They might be the match commander in a football stadium, or they might have a geographic responsibility for a particular area. So I've done that for the last 7 or 8 years. And then last year I did my silver commander's course, and they kind of sit above that and are involved in the planning and then having oversight of it all on the day of an operation. Gold commanders are much too important for me. They tend to be ACC level, and they do the strategic planning, but it's quite generic. So the bronze and the silver commanders are the people who actually do the work for a specific operation. So some of the things I've done around that, I was the bronze commander, took a cohort of 85 South Yorkshire police officers up to Glasgow for COP26. So I was kind of in charge of a sizable group of people for just over 2 weeks up there, for the climate change conference that was involving governments from around the world. A few months before that, I went down to Cornwall, which was a nice little deployment for the G7, when Boris Johnson was hosting six other big sort of the Western democracies. So you had Joe Biden there, among others, which was really interesting. And then I've done football matches, particularly in South Yorkshire, really high profile ones like the Sheffield Derby. I did Millwall coming to Sheffield United when it was what they nominate as a flag day, which is for the old school kind of hooligan element, it was their big day of the season, big sort of afternoon out. So they brought about 750, 800 old school kind of big Millwall hooligans, and obviously Millwall are kind of famous for having quite a sizable firm, and they were all kind of blokes in their 40s and 50s, and I was responsible for the escort to and from the ground, which was a interesting day. Thankfully, it went well, but it was one of those where you look over the 800 people that you're escorting from a load of pubs in Sheffield towards Bramall Lane, and you look at the dozen horses and the 3 PSUs that you've got who are moving that group, and yeah, you feel quite proud of yourself, but sort of proud and slightly scared at the same time. But you try and keep a brave face on it and hope for the best. So that sort of thing's just really interesting, because it's policing definitely makes you a better decision maker, and I think that even more acutely when you get to that sort of level, because you're talking about situations that are incredibly dynamic and contain a high degree of risk, really, in terms of whether you make the right decision. And there's very rarely a sort of black or white answer in policing, and particularly in public order policing, because there's so many variables at play. So I've become a really good decision maker, trusting my judgment, trusting my experience, and kind of playing the odds, really, because it's not black and white. You have to you go for what you think is the right answer, based on your judgment, based on your experience, and as long as you've got sound rationale for why you've made that decision, you're generally in a good position. So it's, you probably talked previously on this channel about the national decision making model, where that really. Yeah, well, that really comes into play, and all the time while you're working as a public order officer, but certainly as a public order commander, that national decision making model is going around in your head, and it might not be as overt as kind of constantly rotating it round and round, but that's just how your brain gets to work, and it's just been really, really useful for me. Firstly, in terms of breadth of experience and doing a bit of travelling and going to different operations and seeing how other forces work, but also just in honing those decision-making skills, which now I think are, pretty well developed, I think.
Amazing. So I'm glad you mentioned the NDM, because that's something I was going to ask you about. So
Go
you've
on.
already done that. Do you use evidence-based policing like SARA and POP policing?
Yeah, so my current role here in Nottinghamshire, when I first landed in Nottinghamshire, I've been working within corporate services, but on Monday I'm moving into neighbourhoods. So I'm going to be the neighbourhoods chief inspector for Bassetlaw, Newark and Sherwood. And from my time in South Yorkshire, I know that POPs policing, problem-oriented policing was used quite extensively. And my expectation is when I move to neighbourhoods, we'll see a lot more of it. And I think that's the way forward, isn't it? I think gone are the days where, as an individual force, you kind of just do something because you've always done it a particular way. I think now there's a sort of a network of national leaders who are able to feed in their experiences and best practice, and then it gets developed across the country. I think about 15-16 months ago now, or maybe it was 2 years ago. You get to this age, Hayley, and all the years roll into one. But I went to the problem-solving conference at Burton, which was really interesting to hear how other forces have tackled some of their problems and be able to learn from them. I think it's the way forward. It just makes sense, doesn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And our former chief constable in South Yorkshire is the national. He was the national lead for problem solving or problem oriented policing, Stephen Watson, and he was a real advocate for it. Which makes, you listen to him, and he's a brilliant public speaker at the best of times. But you listen to him talk about the importance of it, and doesn't even necessarily have to be in policing. We had a talk from. I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was one of the. I think he was deputy head on educating Yorkshire, and yet again, just to hear how other organisations, other professions have utilised problem-oriented problem-oriented problem solving, I guess, to get to where they get to and to progress. I think is a lot of those themes absolutely work in policing in the same way that things that we've done might work in other industries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we're key on at the minute. So one of the actual modules that our students are doing is evidence-based policing, evidence-based practice, and a few people are quite afraid of it originally, but then I think, like, when you explain it like you've just done, then it actually clicks and makes sense. It's like with medicine, isn't it? Like, the reason we've got all these advancements now is because someone's done like evidence application and progression and stuff. So awesome.
Yeah, I remember I had a presentation maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, and it was based on sort of tradition in the police. When we talk about crime levels, we talk about everything in a very linear way. So if you've had 10 shopliftings and 1 murder and 3 burglaries, that equals 14. But actually, there's some weighting there, because murders, the impact of murders is significantly more than it is burglaries, and the impact of burglaries is significantly more than it is for shopliftings. So it was about weighting crime based on the type and based on the harm. I think it was I can't remember what it was called now, but I think it was the crime harm index or something like that. Which is, when you think about it, a much more sensible way of recording crime, because if you record it not only based on volume but also based on the harm of it, that gives you a far better indication of both crime levels but also the impact on local policing and demand on policing, because trying to solve a murder is incredibly time intensive, whereas actually there's not necessarily that much investigation around shopliftings, because either they're caught on CCTV or they're not caught on CCTV generally, and the perpetrators of shoplifting offences tend to be sort of drawn from a fairly small pool, so you probably know them as well. Whereas it's common sense, but murders are generally intense, not only in terms of locating an offender, but then the investigation and the subsequent drawing up of a file. So it's common sense, and a lot of these things aren't they? A sense of a really, really good piece of evidence-based policing is kind of almost common sense, but nobody's quite identified it. So those, as you say, Hayley, it's really important as we go through policing to constantly learn from things we've done well and things we've not done so well, so that you can knock out potential variables.
Thank you. If you were to discuss that communication between, because you are, I just said, a commander already, so silver commander now.
Yes, yeah.
How important is communication between you and other agencies and other forces at these events that you do?
Yeah, really important, because I think I don't profess to be an expert in a lot of what I do, but you build up a network throughout your career. So I think starting from when I joined, when you're on a shift and when you're working around other people and you're trying to find your feet, it's about building relationships, because I might not know as a newly sort of invested officer exactly how to do X, Y, or Z, but there'll be somebody on my shift who's done it 10, 20, 30, 40 times and knows exactly what to do. And equally, as you progress and as you develop your experience, links outside the organisation become important as well. So as a public order commander, I've got people who I know who are safety officers, ground safety officers at Sheffield United and Sheffield Wednesday and Nottingham Forest and Notts County, and I know people who I've worked with as a commander who have now left organisations and gone elsewhere. When I was a staff officer within South Yorkshire, the deputy, the second time I did it, was the national football lead. So I went down to the national football policing unit in Croydon for the Russia World Cup, and I was working down there alongside people who now have left policing and gone into really high profile areas of public order command outside of policing. So they might be in charge of Glastonbury, for example, the safety at Glastonbury. So you develop kind of a network just naturally. But I think key to doing that, and key to policing generally, is communication and the ability to actually sit down and converse with somebody and develop a relationship. One of my observations, I've got kids that are 15 and 12, is that and I know this probably makes me sound really old, but they spend so much time on playing games online or conversing on WhatsApp, or WhatsApp's probably really old. People are probably rolling their eyes at that, but Snapchat or whatever. That's my daughter's favourite. They spend so much time conversing on via that means, as opposed to face-to-face contact. My concern for policing is, and I've always kind of said, you can get yourself out of 95% of sticky situations I don't necessarily say sticky situations, but I'm trying to make it internet friendly. Sticky situations in the police by being able to talk to people and talk people down sometimes, and be able to communicate on various levels. That going forward, if the knock-on effect of people not necessarily being as confident in talking face to face is that they're less able to talk themselves out of situations or talk somebody down from a position where they might become violent, then that could have a sort of quite an impact on policing. So hopefully that won't be the case, and hopefully people will. Human beings are brilliant at communicating generally, and generally human beings are really good at adapting to different scenarios. And so therefore, my wish is that as police officers come into the organisation, they adapt the skills they've learned via being slightly more sort of, I guess, technology-based communication, but they can move it into the face-to-face arena, and that things just naturally adapt. But my fear is that there's a bit of a lag there, and that police officers are exposed to situations where they might get themselves into more confrontational situations because they haven't quite got the same developed face-to-face communication skills as probably my generation. I appreciate that makes me sound really old, but I suppose it's just one of those concerns, isn't it?
What do you think the challenges are facing the police now?
I think what you mentioned earlier around the different routes into policing. There's no, again, I think as I've got longer in service, you appreciate the fact that there are absolute advantages to bringing people in from outside. So when I move into my neighbourhood role, one of the two inspectors that I'm going to be in charge of is a direct entry inspector, and she's got some real skills that have come from outside the organisation, which are transferable and give her a completely different perspective, which I think it's important that policing embraces. But the counterbalance to that is the fact that she hasn't got a basis of experience to kind of rely on, and sometimes she struggles because she hasn't had that kind of that basic knowledge that you would get from doing from being on a response team for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier about some people coming into the organisation not getting a degree because they get it paid for and all that sort of thing, but perhaps not staying. And I think one of my concerns is that there's not really a substitute for experience some of the time. And if we bring people into the service, and then 20, 30, 40% of them leave after 5 years, then you constantly you start to lose that breadth of experience that you gain from, I guess, going through the route that I've gone through, and a lot of the people at my level of service have gone through, which is done lots of different things, got lots of different knowledge and confidence gained from those different things, and you start to lack that because people are leaving. So like I talked about public order command, the reason that I feel like I'm a good public order commander is because I've gone through my career and I've certainly made mistakes, but one of the things about making those mistakes is you learn from them and you make sure you don't do them again. And if you've not got that breadth of experience and you've not made those mistakes, sometimes you've not got those scars that you get from making those errors of judgment, then you're never going to kind of learn where you need to get, like, change your decision making, get better at making that decision, and make the right decision next time. So I suppose that's primarily where my concern is. I think it's going to be difficult to see how, with a change in pension as well, if people stay for the full length of the career, it's difficult to quite understand how sort of 59, 60-year-old police officers will cope, being completely honest, around working a full shift pattern, potentially, pushing a pan around at 60 years old, and the potential for there to be physical confrontations, or pursuits where you get to get out of the car and run after somebody. I think that's there's certainly something for the police service to think about in that regard as well. So yeah, there's a few challenges, but nothing that's insurmountable. But I think the police service is going to have to adapt some of the things that we do to as we go forward in the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years to be cognizant of those sorts of changes that might come down the road.
Fabulous, thank you. Can I ask you, this is a question you probably got asked in your first interview ever. Why did you join the police, or why did you want to join the police?
So I suppose for me, my uncle was a police officer, so he actually worked in Nottinghamshire. He worked as a PC in Nottinghamshire, right up to superintendent, and then joined Suffolk as a chief super. And he he was kind of a role model when I was growing up. My dad was always quite sort of socially awkward and pretty shy, which is probably to a degree where I got my sort of lack of confidence and shyness from. But my uncle was always this big, confident kind of. He's like a big rugby player. He was kind of everything. I guess not wanting to be unkind because my dad died a couple of years ago, so I feel like I'm speaking ill of the dead. But he was always he was the person that I kind of wish my dad was to a degree. And I think from that, I'd looked at him and thought, yeah, that's what I want to be like. And he'd come from a policing background. My grandfather was a special as well, so it kind of at about sort of 14, 15, 16, I kind of formed the opinion that I wanted to be a police officer. And I went to university specifically to have a degree which would to enhance my chances of getting into the police. And then it's the really boring stuff at 21 where I wanted to do something positive for society. I wanted to do a job where I could tangibly finish work at the end of every day and feel like I'd actually contributed positively to the running of society. And I wanted to have a job that I felt was quite reliable. My uncle always used to say, "You'll never be poor as a police officer. You'll never be rich. You'll always be somewhere in between." And now things that I guess now at 47 that are starting to come to fruition, which is things like it's in terms of the length of the career, it's not as long as if I'd become an accountant. I get to retire in 4 years at 51, and the pension is we pay into the pension, we pay 13-14% of our salary into the pension, but it is a good pension. So it was a short-term thing, and the short-term thing of actually having a reliable career, the long-term thing of the pension, but then the other stuff around wanted to be somebody that I felt, if I talked to people, or if I spoke to my kids that were a complete figment of my imagination when I joined the police, but trying to project forward, I wanted to do a job that I felt proud of, and that I thought they would be proud of me doing as well. So a bit of a range. There was no one reason, but it was all that stuff really.
Got the job, brilliant.
Thanks, cheers, appreciate it.
One more question if I've got
No,
time.
of course, yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, you mentioned that you worked in quite a lot of different areas. Did they help you, do you think, to be able to be in a position where you are now to make all these decisions as a chief inspector?
Yeah, definitely, 100%, and it kind of relates back to that thing about there's no substitute for experience in a way. I think, and police officers joining the job now have got a longer career ahead of them than I've had, just by virtue of how the pensions have changed. Really, if they choose to stay in policing, and I'd always encourage people to stay in policing, because I think, I know that I'm the person I am now because I've been a police officer for 26 years, and my personality has developed, markedly from when I was 21, and I credit the police service with a lot of that, because it's given me more confidence, and I'm a better decision maker, and I know when I leave the police in 4 years, if that's what I choose to do, I've got skills that I wouldn't have developed in any other industry at all, and I wouldn't have developed them in the first 4, 5, 6 years. It's taken me perhaps 26 years to develop some of those skills. So I feel like everything that I've done, whether it be being staff officer in the command team, whether it be working in public order policing, neighbourhood policing, so a lot of community work, response policing, where you're working all the shifts and you're really living on your nerves sometimes in terms of some of the situations you go into, because it's very dynamic. I did 12 months, and don't ask me why, Hayley, because I'm not entirely sure myself, but I did 12 months deciding that it would be a good idea to learn how to ride a horse and be the sergeant in Mounted in South Yorkshire, which was great until I fell off the horse and broke my hand in 3 places. So I've done those sorts of range of experiences, but they've all added something to the person I am now, and helped me to make friends in different places. One of the things you're always guaranteed in policing is you're going to be surrounded by good people. Policing attracts really decent human beings generally, and whether it be a bit of a leap of faith, really, moving from South Yorkshire, where I'd been for 25 years, and I knew a huge number of people. I knew how the structures were in South Yorkshire, where to go to get things done, to move to a force where I knew really a handful of people. But it's been an easier transition than I expected, and I put that down primarily to the fact that policing is absolutely full of decent human beings, and wherever you are within policing, you will always be surrounded by good people who want to do the right thing. Going back to one of your previous questions, one of my concerns, I guess, for policing is that given the narrative that's come out of, particularly over the last decade around the negative stories around policing, whether it be from sort of Ian Tomlinson in the Met to policing response to protests, to things like the Sarah Everard murder. The narrative generally that you see in the media and sometimes from politicians is incredibly negative, and that's not taken away from the fact that what happened to Sarah Everard, and what an abhorrent human being Wayne Couzens is, and what a stain he is on the name of policing nationally. That's not to say that those things don't happen, and we've got to be alive to the fact that that might happen again. But it should never take away from the fact that the vast majority of police officers and police staff within the service are here to do a really important job in society and positively contribute to communities. I know after the Wayne Couzens the murder that was undertaken by Wayne Couzens, one of the things that was being said among some communities is if you're a female and you're in trouble and you need somebody, don't approach a police officer. Well, I can tell you from my experience of 26 years working with alongside literally thousands of other people, I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and if she was in a situation where she felt like she needed help, I would absolutely advocate her speaking to a police officer, because while there's no question that you can ask in a recruitment interview, which will prevent you sometimes from recruiting people who join the job for something other than to do the best for society. I'm confident that the structures are in place within the service to identify those people, and 99 times out of 100 to get rid of them as soon as possible. The difficulty is some people are incredibly devious, but those people within policing are genuinely incredibly rare. And sort of the idea that our professional standards departments in policing are actively seeking to protect those people is utter nonsense. Normal police officers and normal police staff will do everything they can to get rid of those people, because it undermines the work that everybody else does. So it's absolutely important that policing is representative of the communities that we serve. And it's absolutely important equally that we are open to the fact that we unfortunately will have people who join the ranks because it's a position of authority to exploit those positions. But what we've got to do is identify those people as quickly as possible and have routes to get them out of the organisation as quickly as possible. And in my experience, those structures are there, and there's nobody keener to get rid of dodgy police officers than honest police officers.
Yeah.
So my experience has got me to a point now where I feel with the breadth of knowledge that I've got and the breadth of experiences I've got, I feel like I'm a really well qualified, well established officer who has gone into a role as a chief inspector that I feel confident I can fulfil. I'm not the kind of person who could bluff my way through a situation. So if I'm being honest, if I'd got to be a chief inspector at 16 years service, for me personally, that wouldn't have worked, because I would have felt like a swan. I would have been desperately panicking and paddling underwater while trying to look as serene as possible and waiting to get exposed. Whereas now, I genuinely feel like, I've got confidence in my own ability. I've got confidence based on the experience I've got, that I can fulfil the role that I'm employed to do. Some people are different. Some people are incredibly good at bluffing their way through it, but that's just not me, unfortunately. So yeah, I feel like I've had a fantastic career. It's not over yet. Got 4 years left, so I sound like I'm dying. But I've had a fantastic career in the police. Really enjoyed it. Had the opportunities to experience all sorts of stuff that I never thought I would, both negative and positive. I've been first on scene to a couple of murders, first on scene to fatal road accidents, that sort of thing, which are really sad situations to be thrust into. But at the same time, that's where your training comes in, and that's where you kind of almost slip into autopilot, and your adrenaline kicks in a bit, and you know that what you've got to do is the right thing, because it's critical to later on in investigations. But I've also had some really, some hugely positive experiences and great opportunities, because I've kind of put myself in a position where I've been happy to take on extra roles and I've volunteered for things. And I think if you do that in policing, you know, the world is your oyster to a degree, and there are some, you know, policing is unique in terms of the breadth of opportunities that are open to you. And all I'd say to people who, you know, are joining the job, don't just focus on thinking, right, well, I want to be a sergeant, I want to be an inspector and chief inspector, superintendent, and I want to get there as quickly as possible, because you're a long time in you know, as a police officer, and there are some roles which you only get access to as a PC or a sergeant. So, you know, look to try and gain a breadth of experience before you're solely focused on kind of progressing vertically.
Thank you. I was just about to ask if you got any advice as your last thing, parting shot, but I think you've just done
Yeah.
it.
See, it's almost like I've had access to your questions before I've had them, Hayley,
I
although
know.
I haven't.
I'm just making them up, so yeah,
No,
excellent.
it's all right. So yeah, that would probably be it. You know, just enjoy it. I think there are times, you know, the policing is, it's a unique profession. There are times where you're living on your nerves a little bit and you're exposed to situations, you know, physical situations that you wouldn't necessarily, as a member of the public, be exposed to. There are times where you've got to run. It's a bit of a cliche, but you've got to run towards danger when others would run away. But embrace that, because that's what you trained for. That's what you joined the job for. You know, and really the best thing about policing for me personally is the people that you work with, and the fact that you work as part of a team where there are times when your life could be in their hands and vice versa, and that breeds a really strong team ethic. And you know, just know that there will always be people there to support you. There will always be people who will back you up if you're in you know, a tricky situation. But the trade-off for that is that you've got to be prepared to do the same for them. So if you hear somebody going to a, you know, pub fight at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night and they're single crewed, you know, you need to be mindful, actually they need backup. And then the trade-off is that they'll do the same for you, because it's a team game, policing. And ultimately when it boils down to it, it's, you know, if you're talking about it on its base level, it's like a big game of cops and robbers. And you know, you should always remember that we're the good guys and we're trying to catch people, put them behind bars, and hopefully there they'll get rehabilitated and they won't come around again. But policing is a positive thing. But policing is something that is tangible and is, you know, is adding good, to society. It's adding positivity to society, and that's why I joined the job, and that's really why anybody should join the job, because it's, you know, I go home every day, and my job's slightly different now, and it's not necessarily locking people up in the same way it used to be. But I know that I work for an organisation, in whichever policing service it is around the country, we are doing positive things for society. Whatever you might read in the media, whatever the politicians might tell you, the simple fact is that if the police didn't exist, then society would fall apart. So yeah, we're a force for good, and that is something that should motivate everybody on a daily basis to get out of bed and come into work.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.